All right, folks. Now, please don't get me wrong. Richard Nixon was not a good guy. We know about the war against the Vietnamese people and millions of people being killed. We know about the crushing of the Black Freedom Movement by the FBI and all that was done there. I'm not saying the man was a good guy. However, if you look at the fact that he was president of the United States and that he had a job to do, he arguably did it better than anybody else. Basically, in 1968, when Richard Nixon was first elected president, the USA was in a big crisis. There were huge rebellions going on among the African-American community, huge protests against the Vietnam War. The USA was losing the Vietnam War, and I mean, it was a bad time. It was a domestic political crisis. The country was just kind of in a state of unrest, and Richard Nixon was selected by the American ruling class, the billionaires and the bankers that run the United States, for the purpose of bringing the United States back into order. They wanted him to come in and solve the crisis. Now, he campaigned, he said he was for the silent majority, right? That was, the working class people who didn't, join the hippie protests, and, this is the white working class, this isn't the black working class that was in rebellion. He was for the silent majority, he said. He was going to restore order. He was going to be the law and order candidate, and he came into office. He said that he had a secret plan to win the Vietnam War, so he took office as President of the United States, and his job that he was assigned by the American ruling class was to restore the United States to order, and he did it. By the time he resigned in 1974, the whole political crisis of the 1960s was history. People were already at that point talking about back in the 60s. It was done. All right, what did Nixon do? He did it by getting a lot of things done. Richard Nixon at that time, for example, in the USA, there was a lot of alienation among young people. They didn't feel involved in the political system. So Nixon passed a constitutional amendment to lower the voting age to 18. At that point, the world was in rebellion against the United States. There were, different countries fighting against the USA. So Nixon discovered, this block, this disagreement between Russia and China, and he followed a specific geopolitical strategy engineered by Henry Kissinger, and he restored diplomatic relations with China and essentially got China on the side of the United States against the Soviet Union. And pretty soon, in places like Angola and elsewhere, China was aligned with the United States in terms of foreign policy. He created the Environmental Protection Agency. He passed the workplace health and safety legislation. There was a real danger when the first economic downturn happened in the early 70s that the political crisis could become even more widespread. So Richard Nixon, he kicked Milton Friedman, the neoliberal economist, out of the White House, and he said, we're all Keynesians now. He started imposing wage controls and price controls. Richard Nixon, he took action. He was an authoritarian, and he suppressed other members of his own class. He suppressed other members of the political establishment, and he got a lot done, and he resolved the crisis. Now, he broke the law in order to do it, but do you think these other politicians aren't doing what he does? Do you think what did they get him for? It was Watergate. That's ultimately what he had to resign for. Now, do you think that other politicians aren't, breaking into the offices of other politicians and wiretapping them and spying on them and doing intelligence and hacking them and doing emails? We all know that both sides of the political establishment are constantly, spying on each other and attacking each other. Furthermore, Richard Nixon, they say he had this enemies list, then he punished people if they broke his rules. Do you think that other politicians don't have enemies lists of people that are on their no-good list, as other people would call it? I mean, come on. Richard Nixon was an authoritarian. He was breaking the law, but he was doing it in order to save American capitalism from a huge political crisis. He went to the FBI. He told them to take the gloves off and just crush the Black Panthers. He passed sweeping legislation. He made sweeping moves in terms of geopolitics, lowered the voting age to 18. He had that secret plan to end the Vietnam War, which was massive bombing. And when it didn't work, he ultimately pulled out of Vietnam and did what other presidents couldn't do. The massive bombing campaign didn't work. He bombed Cambodia. That didn't work. And so then he pulled out. He took all kinds of action that no president has taken. Now, he wasn't a good guy. He was doing it for the purpose of maintaining American capitalism and imperialism and the dominance of Wall Street billionaires in the world. But I don't think you can point to any president since the Second World War who was more effective in doing that. And he did it. He took office when the country was in a huge crisis. He restored order very dramatically, suppressing lots of members of the political establishment in order to get it done. And by the time he resigned, by the time he'd resigned, the crisis was over. American capitalism was once again in ascendancy. The crisis was finished off. Now, it's interesting because he was such an effective ruler. He got so much done for American capitalism, but he's probably the most hated person. He was hated by the left. They called him a dictator and an authoritarian, which he was. He was becoming very authoritarian in order to strengthen American capitalism and imperialism. But further than that, furthermore, he was also widely hated. He's still widely hated by conservatives. Ann Coulter has a book where she calls him a liberal, where she says that the right wing also hates Richard Nixon. Everyone hates Richard Nixon. He's one of the most hated figures in American history. He's probably the most demonized president that we have, yet he was the most effective. No one did more effective of a job or more of a better job of saving American capitalism and imperialism. Richard Nixon was handed a task when he became president, and he got it done. And he's the most hated one, and everyone hates him. And society went back into order. They didn't need a strong man anymore. And so the very ruling class that had employed him to come in and be a strong man and be a tyrant and bring society back into order, what did they do? They brought him down. The Watergate scandal, he was exposed and humiliated. I mean, it's just one of the greatest ironies of history. I'm not a fan of Richard Nixon at all, but if you look at somebody who probably got a raw deal, somebody who really, you want to talk about getting the job done and doing what they're asked to do, the American ruling class asked Richard Nixon to do what he did. He did it, and they hated him for it. And that just shows the irony of American politics.